Hello, it's Demi from Priestess here for another Avalon Priestess TV. And today we're talking about myth and how myth changes. So, from our modern perspective, we have a bit of a funny relationship with myth. When we think about the great goddesses and gods of the ancient worlds, we think about Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty and sex. We think of Zeus, the big thunder god, top of a mountain. We think of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. But their roles and their myths are not as clear-cut as we like to think in the modern world. The myths of the ancient gods and goddesses changed hugely over the time that they were in power. So say Aphrodite, she was worshipped under many different names for at least 1500 years. I mean, she's still worshipped now by people like me, but she was worshipped for at least 1500 years. That means that her myth will have changed. Her myths and stories around her changed. Who she was and how she showed up and what she was worshipped as changed. If we look at the start of Aphrodite's worship, we have her as a goddess of the earth, great earth goddess, Kypris, and we have her as a goddess of copper, of mines as well. Yeah, a little bit. And then if we go straight to Roman times, when she's been syncretized with Venus, we have Aphrodite as the woman, the goddess who keeps wives chaste. Yeah, big difference. The role of a goddess changes over a long period of time. And the myths of a goddess, the myths we have, are not set in stone. The thing is, we've grown up in the West with this example of the Bible being our great repository of myth, and I'm going to call it a repository of myth today. And this is where we get the idea of, if it's written down, that is the right way, and it has to be the way it's written down, and you can't argue with it, and that's the truth, and that's where it is. And we have this huge passion and respect and complete "I cannot touch you" honor for the written word. If it's written down, that's truth, that's how it is. That's how we look at it with the Bible, and that's how we look at it with the myths of the ancient world. For example, that's how we look at it with the Hesiod's Theogony. And Hesiod was the dude that wrote down a lot of the creation myths and the stories of the gods in the ancient Greek world. And this was maybe, I'm going to butcher this, sometime between, I think it was around 800 BC. So he wrote down these stories, and that's what has survived and passed down to us. These are the stories. This is what happened. This is how everyone was viewed. However, those were just the stories that Hesiod wrote down, the ones he knew and the way he told the story. In the ancient world, there would have been so many different interpretations, so many different retellings of the story. And a good myth would come from how good the storyteller was, yeah? How the storyteller described things, how the storyteller put their own spin on it. A myth isn't a fixed thing. It's a living, breathing wisdom story. And even though nowadays we have this perception of a myth being, oh, it has to be exactly as it was, we have to find the exact one right, perfect myth, there never was one. There isn't a one right, perfect, correct myth for a lot of our gods and goddesses. There are stories that have been told in 1,000 different ways, keeping the same themes, but there will not be this is the one true version and every other version is a lie. That's something we've inherited from the Bible, and that's something we've inherited from the weird way Christianity's been around the world, yeah? There is one way, every other way is terrible, yeah? That's not us, okay? And we see this really clearly in Celtic stories. Of course, we don't actually have really any Celtic myths left. We just have the Mabinogi. The Mabinogi is a collection of Celtic myths, we think, folk tales, recorded from Wales by some Christian clerics in about the 11th century, yeah? 11th, 12th century. maybe 13th century, sometime around those times. And we don't know 100% that these are myths about gods and goddesses, but we do know that the ancient Druid people, they had a whole class of storyteller whose job it was to remember the stories and tell them. Go around the country sharing these stories, these bards, these storytellers. And these storytellers would become known for how good they were for their own versions of a myth. It isn't that they would remember this tale of Ceridwen and the best guy is the one who can remember it word for word. No, the best bard would be the one who could tell the story in the most compelling way, who could find the depths and bring them out of that myth, which means someone telling the same story in one town might be very different to how they tell it in another town. And that's fine, it's still myth. The god and the goddess shift and change all the time. They're not a rigid thing, okay? So we know how myth changes, and we touched on how the roles of gods and goddesses change as well. We touched on how Aphrodite changed. She was Kypris, she was the goddess of the earth, she was the great queen, she was the great mother goddess, and she turned into a goddess of just sex and seduction and annoying love that gets in the way. Yeah, that's her arc. And something I believe is very important, and something that many people are reclaiming these days, is that it's not just the gods and goddesses of the past that changed. It's not just the people of the past that had the right to change and shift the meanings of their gods and goddesses. We have it still now. So I have 3 examples of this. Number 1, my teacher Katinka Sutens of the Path of Love Mystery School runs an amazing training about the goddess Rhiannon. However, this training and Katinka's perspective of Rhiannon is a modern retelling of Rhiannon. It is not rooted hugely, I believe, in the historical things we have for Rhiannon. Those historical things deeply inform Katinka's work, but she is not slavish to them. She has allowed her own inspiration and her own oracle nature to reinterpret the goddess as she has seen it, as she has experienced it, as other people are experiencing her in the modern world. And even though that version of Rhiannon is very different to the Rhiannon we see portrayed in the Mabinogi, which again is the only place we have any record of Rhiannon, that doesn't make this modern Rhiannon not real, and it doesn't make her not valid. Gods are supposed to change, and of course the gods change along with society. It's not really reasonable to think that we have to be worshipping and connecting with a god now in exactly the same way as we did 1,000, 2,000 years ago, when life is so different now to how it was 2,000 years ago. Yeah, gods change and evolve. That's what they do. Another example is Morgan Le Fay. Woohoo, my favorite goddess. Morgan Le Fay is a goddess who has only really been mentioned as a goddess in ancient texts and stories once. Yeah, she's more of a legendary figure in the remaining texts that we have. However, she is still a goddess. Modern witches and priestesses and people who are connecting and exploring this stuff, we really strongly feel that presence of Morgan Le Fay as a goddess. And we have looked into her myths and stories to really pull through this thread of the divine that she holds. So even though 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, there may not have been a goddess explicitly named as Morgan Le Fay, the entity that we call Morgan Le Fay now might have been under a different name. Or she might have been nameless. Who knows? She could have been one of the other goddesses that we have records of. Even though her name would have been different back then, we are still putting a name to that powerful energy, and she is still real. The modern day mythology of Morgan Le Fay is no less valid than the mythology of Jesus or the mythology of Athena. It's just God's moving and shifting with the times. And the third one I wanted to share with you is the goddess Nolava. So in Kathy Jones's Priestess of Avalon tradition, they name the goddess of Avalon as not Morgan Le Fay, as a separate divine force. And this goddess is a modern invention. This goddess has white hair and purple skin. She is called Nolava, which is Avalon backwards, because she is the mirror of Avalon. And this goddess now has a temple in Glastonbury. This goddess is the heart of the Priestess of Avalon tradition with the Glastonbury Goddess Temple. And she has been rebirthed and reborn as a modern day goddess. There is no Nolava written in any historical text. Nowhere, 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 nowhere. Yeah. We have the Lady of Avalon as a divine being. We have the Lady of Avalon as a fairy queen. We don't have her explicitly as a goddess anywhere. And we definitely do not have her under the name Nolava. However, a new goddess has been birthed through the Glastonbury Goddess Temple. And this is what people have been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's not a new thing. We found an energy. We found a goddess energy, and this is a goddess of place, the Lady of Avalon, very connected with Glastonbury. Nolava is very connected with Glastonbury. We found a divine energy and we've given it a name. We've reinterpreted it for a modern age. We've given her a new mythology. This is what happens. This is how gods are born. This is how gods exist and shapeshift and change. This idea of there being one right way to understand a story of a god, or one right thing that they were a god of, there's no one right way, because according to what time? Aphrodite in 500 BC would have been very different to Aphrodite 1200 BC. I mean, 1200 BC, she wasn't even called Aphrodite yet, I don't think. Yeah? So gods shift and change. So I just really want you to really hold that and hold that weirdness and that letting go of this very biblical idea of that what is written is the rule and everything else there is a right and a wrong way. No. Myth is living. Myth is breathing. Myth is always changing and adapting to suit the people of the times. Yeah? Myth is a wisdom story. Myth is here to echo a sacred chord to us. And it doesn't work if it's not relevant and if we don't connect with it in our time, right? So I want to leave you with the mythic magic, the living power of myth, and the knowledge of these goddesses that have been reclaimed and reborn and reinvented and rebirthed from not existing before often, or existing in such a different way. We're never going to know. We can't time travel. We can't go back to 500 AD and see if what Morgan Le Fay's name was back then. It's not possible. And we don't need to. Beautiful. So hopefully this has opened your eyes. If you'd love to learn more about Avalon in particular, one of my heart favorite reborn myths, I have a free gift that you can download. It's called the 7 Priestess Arts of Avalon. It is a beautiful illustrated guidebook to the core heart qualities and practices of a priestess of Avalon, and it's like an illuminated manuscript. I get really into this idea of having beautiful grimoires for us to treasure and adore. So if you'd like your own beautiful grimoire of Avalon, boop, down below will be a link where you can download it. And I hope you have a wonderful time. Goodbye.